Welcome, everyone, to the first inaugural meeting of Access Pacific, our newest chapter of AccessUserGroups.org. I am the founder of the organization, Juan Soto, Access MVP. This is now a three-continent organization, North America, South America, and Europe. So we're really excited to have a chapter in Pacific time. It's 8:30 in Chicago at central headquarters. So I'm probably going to be on here for just a few minutes. I wanted to make sure George got kicked off really good, and I wanted to super thrilled to have George hosting this chapter
Yeah.
on the West Coast. George Hepworth has been a former Access MVP and as well as a book author on Access and SharePoint, probably one of the most foremost authorities on the topic and on
Well,
the globe. And wanted to thank you guys for showing up and providing us showing a show of support for George. It means a lot to both of us that you guys are here.
yeah.
And George, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you for including me in this family. Uh, I have been retired essentially for the last 5 years. I had some health challenges along there, and I felt like I needed to kind of step away and wind down and take care of some issues, and that worked really great for a while. And probably the best part of that whole experience was the phone stopped ringing. Because, and you guys that are independent consultants know exactly what I mean. If the phone rings, hopefully somebody with a problem. So it's not much fun. But that was really probably the best part. But then, as time went on, I realized that it was time to get back in. So when Juan brought up the subject of chapter out here on the Pacific Coast, I said, sure, I'll do it. I'd be happy to get involved again. And that leads me to the next point. I'm kind of nervous because I've been out of the loop for a while, a bit rusty, so I'm kind of, I've been practicing since 8 o'clock this morning. I hope I haven't overdone it. But I'd just like to take the opportunity again to thank Juan and his team there. They made the ability to participate really smooth, and they've come a long ways with these groups. It was a real good experience getting set up. So I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, the chapter meets every Thursday, first Thursday of the month. We like to meet Tuesdays and Thursdays because usually holidays fall on Monday or Friday, so
Well,
Thursdays are good. And I know George is working really hard on a good list of presenters going forward. If any of you are interested in presenting in future meeting, please reach out to George. You can do that. George, you want to share an email address with the group?
sure. I'll put that in the chat window.
Wonderful. Yeah, so if anybody has any topic suggestions or any
Yeah.
ideas of what to talk about going forward, please let us know. I only have a few announcements and then we'll get started. One of the things that I want to talk about is the new auto-powered desktop from Microsoft. I'm putting a link here in the chat. If you haven't checked it out, please do so. The Power Automate desktop. If you ever wanted a macro language for Windows, this is it. Now, it used to cost $10 a month to have this as a license, and Microsoft last month made it free. So you can go download it now, that link I gave you, or you can wait and eventually it'll show up as part of Windows. Now, this thing is just amazing. And one of the things that I want to say is that it'll scrap web pages for data. It'll interact with browsers, not just programs. There's a macro recorder there. You can change the code. It's just a really heavy stuff. So I can see the huge potential with Access applications using this. For example, you might have a process that your client may need to start at 3 o'clock every morning. So you can create this Power Automate desktop program that will launch your Access application. Maybe log into QuickBooks, get the data, and then close everything down. So just a wonderful, wonderful macro language for Windows. So if you ever wanted one, nowadays they used to sell these, and they still do. You could buy a macro language for $35, maybe $40, but now it's free. It's from Microsoft. And
Okay.
then this week we had the MVP Summit just wrapped up yesterday. I have some sad news. Devcon, who was on my presentation a couple of weeks back, he's leaving Microsoft. And so we're sorry to see him go. He was probably one of the two best PMs we've had in Access. And so we're sorry to see him go. And but if you haven't already, you may want to check out blog post I have at AccessUserGroups.org that talks about all the news that he made at our last meeting at SQL Server with Access. And I'm going to send you that link right now. And the biggest announcement made was Access 2022 is coming. So we are really excited about that they're going to do a new version of Access. Keep in mind that Access and 365 is not the same thing as the perpetual. They call it perpetual license. The perpetual license. So you can go out to Office Depot or Staples or whatever store and download and buy it. And that's not the same version of Access you get with Office 365. So we call that Office 365 Access, and we got perpetual license 22. So please take a look at that slide. We should probably have the video up there up and running. All right, George, take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear it. I have to ask because, well, I just have to ask. Is there any other news out of the MVP Summit that is not NDA that you could share?
Oh, George. Get me in trouble.
Not NDA.
You want me to, now you know the secret handshake, George. I don't
Yeah.
have to tell you that. You know the secret handshake Access MVPs have.
Okay. No, but there's nothing that, okay, that's fine.
Well, no, look at that link and post it in the comments.
Mm-hmm.
There were several things. Number one is the number one thing that I took away from the summit, because they mentioned it in the public, so I can discuss this, is Access and the cloud are going to get a lot tighter going forward.
Okay.
I mean, a lot tighter. So the Access team is working furiously to make the Access product much more cloud friendly. It was never designed for the cloud because Access was here before the cloud. George, what was the first version of Access that you worked with?
Well, actually ADPs came before, and I was never involved with them. The first one that I ever saw was we had Access web databases that were essentially SharePoint. And that was actually, I thought it was a pretty good option, but it had its limitations. And
But what was the first version of Access that you used? Did you have hair on your head back then?
my first version was 2.0.
Oh, there you go. So was mine.
Yeah.
And back then there was no cloud, and so it's over the years it's been hard to integrate Access with cloud services. So I'm really loving what the team is doing now.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing. That's what I was hoping to hear. So I'm looking forward to that. I think it's actually one of the reasons I decided I wanted to get more involved again, because it seems like something that will carry the product forward for a long time in the future. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I just kind of give you a little bit of introduction to me and how I think about development. And I think it has some implications about the kind of presentations that I would pick or solicit for the chapter, and also introduce one tool that I use that I've developed for my own personal use based on that kind of thinking. And then save the last, 10, 15 minutes for your suggestions, comments, discussion about future presentations that you would like to see, because I think that's going to be the backbone of the organization, is presenting topics that are of interest to most people. So with that in mind, I'm going to hop into a little quick PowerPoint and talk a little bit about how I view programming. Now, as I fumble with the buttons.
Well, while you're getting that ready, I do have one announcement. Carl in Europe is putting on Access Devcon, and I will be presenting this year on how to do a Access consulting, how to get customers, how to close deals. How do you close a $25,000 deal over the phone? Most of my deals are over the phone. I never get to see the customer. So how do you do that? How do you get customers? How do you close leads? It's going to be an amazing session. I have no secrets. If you ever want to know how I have a multi-million-dollar practice in Access, I have no secret. I have no problem sharing with you guys all I do, and I'm going to be sharing that in the Europe conference at Devcon. So let me get you that Devcon link. So if you haven't registered yet, please do so. They've already got a lot of people from even from China going. Carl was telling me so. It's called Access Devcon in Vienna, and I'm going to send the link here. Go ahead, George.
Okay, great. Yeah, I signed up for the DevCon this year. Looks
Well,
really
thank you.
interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to. Okay, so I call this my guiding principle. This is how I think about access development. Yeah,
There's your email and your phone number. That's great.
yeah, there's my email and phone number on all the slides.
All right.
So let's start at the beginning. I call this my guiding principle, and after 2 decades of working with Access, more than 2 decades, when Juan asked me the first version, it's like 1994 was when I first started using Access. I developed a lot of ideas over the years, some good, some not so good, but 2 decades of experience have kind of honed my thinking. One of the things that I have come to believe very strongly is that simpler is almost always better. So if I have a choice between ways to do something, methods, alternative designs, I'll almost always try to pick the simpler of the two. And that comes partly out of billing clients for the work. You know, if you can do something that's going to be effective and get their job done, that's a lot more impactful than trying to do something really elegant that simply doesn't add any value, especially when you're billing. Now, I will say that you never say never. That's another axiom. But I will say that it's almost always preferable to try to find the simpler solution. Out of that comes one of my principal soapboxes, which is that for data, the tried and true table design or normalization just works. This partly comes from a lot of time spent working with clients, but also a lot of time working in online forums like Utter Access and Microsoft Answers. We see a lot of innovative, creative table designs. And it always ends up being a case of, well, we can make it work this way, or we can convert it to a truly normalized, basic, old-fashioned, tried and true table design, and it will just work. And in logic, my guiding principle is that low code is better than code wads. And I came up with the term code wads to describe what I was
What is
trying
it? Code wads.
Well, okay, if you think of the analogy, you have a stick of chewing gum and you chew it up, and instead of throwing away, you stick it on the bottom of your desk.
Yeah.
And then the next day you chew up another piece and you stick it on that. Pretty soon you got this great big wad of code hanging down from the bottom of your desk. And so I kind of looked at some of this code that I've written over the years and I've seen other people do. And I think that's just a great big wad of code. And probably the classic example of that was a project I picked up that had been through the hands of at least 4 previous developers that I could recognize their coding styles. And although they all were effective, they got the job done, they all 4 of us or 5 of us had slightly different approaches, and it was just a great big wad of sticky code. And I was always nervous about working on it for fear that I would touch something that was going to break something else, because I didn't know what was inside that big wad of code. And that's kind of where the analogy of the code wad came from.
I like it.
So that led me to some guidelines that I try to follow. And I think most of us probably do take advantage of these design principles. One is good design principles are universal. And so whatever Access offers in terms of good design principles, normalization for tables, and built-in access features, that should be our first choice. And I'm thinking, for example, like a table of products that it's going to be sold to the public. One of the attributes of a product would be its sales price. And one of the things you want to do with your sales price is make sure that it's a positive number, or maybe a zero, because you can always give your products away for zero, but you probably want to sell them for something, but you don't want to set a negative price and give everybody a $5 bill with every purchase, because you're going to go out of business real quick. So one of the rules you want is that prices must be greater than zero. Well, you can do that in the table itself. You can set a validation rule. It's on that field and it specifies price must be greater than or equal to zero. And from then on, you don't have to worry about it. The validation is taken care of internally by the database. The engine itself manages that. So when you have that kind of feature built into Access, or actually that's true of any relational database, I guess. When you have that kind of feature, take advantage of it rather than try to duplicate it yourself, because you may or may not find a solution that's going to cover as well. The other example I came up with is things like lookup tables, where you've got a closed domain, say state abbreviations, the two-letter state abbreviations, state and provinces. And instead of letting free-form entry and forcing people to remember that it's AK for Alaska and AL for Alabama, you show them those choices and make them pick one of the two. Then you can enforce that choice by using foreign key constraints on the tables. And again, that's a built-in database feature that's going to take care of that logic. And you don't have to write additional code logic to handle those things. And that's kind of the point I'm driving at. And again, this comes up quite often, I think, once you get past the most basic level, is that if you have two options or three options, I would almost always choose the one that requires the least code. An obvious example of that would be bound and unbound forms. Access is more or less unique in offering bound forms. It takes care of all the data management tasks for you. You don't have to write code to load and save your data. In my career, I was trying to think of this today, and I came up with two counter examples, where we actually went the other way. One was a physical rehab clinic, and they needed to have their normalized data for scheduling so they could do utilization reports on facilities and their rehab therapists. But they also wanted to give their schedulers what amounted to a calendar view, so that instead of having to pick from a drop-down list or from a list box, they could have a week at a time, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, across a grid, and just pop the appointment into that. So we compromised. Actually, it took about 3 or 4 days of discussion back and forth, but we decided in that case, the unbound form, well, actually it was bound to a temp table, but it wasn't bound to the underlying data. In that case, it was more effective to use the non-normalized display for the scheduling, because it gave their schedulers a look at the data that was more comfortable for them to use. It did require more code, of course, to move the data back and forth between the temp table, but we came to the conclusion that it was a trade-off worth making. And the other one was even more interesting. That was a local artisan brewery that came to us to write program to schedule their brew. They had 5 fermentation vats. No, 5. Was it 5 or 4? I think it was 4 fermentation vats, and they needed to schedule different batches, different types of beer into those. And the kicker for them was, it turns out that different types of beer take different amounts of time to brew. So one might be 3 days, the other one might take 5 days. So you couldn't just say, if we put the beer on Monday, we'll clean it on Thursday, refill it on Friday. You had to say, well, now what kind of beer it is. And you couldn't schedule different kinds of beers into there. It became quite a challenge. So we ended up doing the same kind of calendar. I actually didn't do that when one of my colleagues, some of you have heard me talk about my friend Frank. Frank was the one who ended up with that task, and he built a really, really slick sliding scheduler for brews, but it required pulling the data into the non-normalized format and a lot of code. So those are the two exceptions, but the rest of the time, I think in all those years, I pretty much prevailed on people to go with the normalized data route, minimizing code in the process. Okay, so the last principle is we don't rely on wads and wads of code to compensate for poor design decisions. And I found an example. This example actually came up, I can't remember whether it was on Utter Access or Microsoft Answers or one of the others, but this was presented as a challenge by a poster. Now, the idea here is that tasks conflict. So if you, I didn't mean to click on it. I was trying to isolate it out. These tasks, task 1, task 2, and task 3, were mutually exclusive. The same person could not do all 3 tasks. Well, if you look at this table, there's nothing in here that says employee A can't do this. And the person was struggling really hard to tie this table to their employee table and figure out how to manage this. Well, one look at the table, and we all know, I think, one of the big problems is that this is not a normalized design. You've got multiple values in each field, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, 3, 5, and so on. So my response to him was, well, let's fix the table design first. We'll normalize this, get that sorted out, and then we can worry about relating that to employees and doing a junction table, really. What it would have been at the end would be a junction table to relate employees to tasks and figure out which ones were mutually exclusive. Well, he didn't want to do that. And someone else stepped in, and I won't name names, but someone else stepped in and wrote this very long, elaborate VBA function using parameter arrays. I think it was an array. We used an array of some kind to parse each of these fields out into the components and then write a record set to compare each one to the employee table. And it was just, at the end of it, is what I would call a code wad. Great big wad of code to accomplish a task that could have been done much more simply, much more directly by relying on the features and functions inherent in a relational table design. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. And as I look forward to this chapter, it's the kind of thing that I would like to emphasize, bringing in ideas, presentations to make sure we're offering our fellow developers, good tools and good methods and good approaches to solving database problems. And that leads me to the next thing here. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the clocks because I want to leave some time for discussion of presentations. But one of the things that came out of that whole stream of thinking is what I call a code library. I think we all probably maintain them. The code that we've written over the years that we want to reuse. And actually, FMS has an application that they sell that has a code library.
Nice.
So, but in working through all this, I started thinking about, well, how do I take advantage of the fact that I've done so many of these tasks over and over and over? And I started looking at creating a code library. I'm thinking of things like, like error messages. you use error messages in virtually every database. So I wanted to be able to just pick an error message, an error handler, I should say, not an error message, but an error handler, and incorporate it into a new database without having to rewrite it all again. So my first attempt was I took all of those code procedures, the VBA and the subs, and I exported them as text files and into a folder, and I called it CodeArchive. And in CodeArchive, I just had a whole wad, I'm going to use the same term to describe it, a whole big wad of these little text files that were all the different functions that I'd used. And that worked better because I could go find one and import it. But I realized fairly quickly that what was happening is I had 2 or 3 versions of each one. So then I had to stop and look at the text file and say, okay, this has got the features that I want. And that led me to my next step, my second code library. And it was actually, I created a database, an access file, an AccessDB, and I called it CodeArchive because it started out as the archive of code. And I imported all of those little subs and functions back into it, and then I could just directly import them. And it was easier to work with. I could find the one that I wanted. And that kind of led to the next step, which was I said, okay, I've got 3 different error handlers. I've got 4 different ways of handling not in list events. I've got 3 ways of handling sub data sheets. And I started merging them together, consolidating. So I tried to get that down to a smaller number, and that became more effective. One of the outcomes of that process is it forced me to be much more consistent. Because if I was going to come up with a function that I was going to reuse and reuse and reuse, it better be effective. It better be very generic, and it better be something that I wouldn't have to modify to suit specific applications. And if I did have to modify it, it would have to be for specific features in that database that didn't fit the norm. So it was almost a byproduct, an inadvertent byproduct of this process, was that I became a lot more consistent about how I wrote these things. And so then, somewhere along the line, it occurred to me that I could use that AccessDB as a library reference. So instead of importing each of those functions, and when you import something from one file into another, you fork that data. And no matter how careful you are, you sooner or later say, I'm just going to tweak this right here, and then I'll remember to put it back in the others, right? And that never happens. And then you're back to the multiple versions again. So set it as a library reference, and you can do that with an AccessDB or even an MDB, I guess, in your code. And then instead of having to import and modify it, as soon as I set that reference, all of that code is available to whatever project I'm working on. And I started out by bringing everything in. And as I said, I started then consolidating and throwing things out. I've tried to pare it down to just the subs and functions that I have used more than once or anticipate someday using more than once. And I'm going to launch a little demo now to talk about that. And I'll walk through this really quickly, and then we'll save about 15 minutes for discussion in the future. Okay, this is one of my personal databases. I picked this one because it is pretty non-proprietary, there's not a lot of personal information here to worry about. This, by the way, is actually a website that I manage for my family. And what we're looking at here is the web browser control in the opening form. And in this web browser control, the URL points to my family website. That's the download site. And in this website, I manage a second website from here. And this second one is my photo catalog. And what this one does, I have a second website where I have gathered, over the years I've gathered, I think I'm now up close to 3,000, 2,941 images. And these are all from the time I was 1 year old till last summer. And I'm cataloging and working with them, trying to get them ready to go. So I'm just going to pick one and show you a little bit, do a little bit of a tease here. Okay, so that's me in about 2007, 2008, in my backyard on the 5th of July. And so
Wow.
this website,
That was quite the change from now.
yeah, I that's one of the reasons why I picked it for this demo. I say, wow, look at that guy. There's a whole lot of red. Not just the flowers, but that shirt. There's a whole lot of that shirt. So anyway, this website, some of the things you can do in the website itself. You can set the caption for the photo, a description, or the title, caption, or description. You can set tags. You can create a tag cloud. You've seen tag clouds on a lot of places. So anything you create a tag for will show up in that tag cloud. Or there's a search feature. So if I want to search, I put people's names here. But I manage this all from this Access database. These tables are all linked to the SQL Server behind the website. And like I say, the website itself has the ability to manage all this stuff. But I just find it a whole lot easier to do it here than trying to do it through the web interface. So anyway, that's what this one's about. But the point of this is actually to show you the code library as it's set up. And for some reason, it's not going to start. Trust me, this worked 20 times today already. I'm not sure why I'm seeing this delay.
It's always like that when you go to present, it's a challenge.
Yeah, it just goes, okay. Sorry about that. All right, so as you can see, sorry. I just, my voice is doing this. And one of the things I've discovered being home alone by myself, some of you are locked down because of the COVID, but I've been kind of home by myself for several years now, retired. When I start talking, my voice is cracking because I don't use it that much anymore. Big problem. Anyway, this section is the database we're looking at, quote of the day photos. This section is the CodeArchive. And the way I get it here is I go to the references and I browse. Oops. Oh, this is a good example. All right. Actually, I'm focused on CodeArchive, so I'm not going to find a reference to CodeArchive in itself. You can see it's not here. There is a potential reference to the database where it's running, but if I switch, you can see it's opening the code for this section. And now if I go to references, come on. You see there's a reference set to CodeArchive, and I made a copy. This is not the production version I use. I have it in a shared network location where all of my databases can get to it. But I made a copy for this presentation, so just in case I biff it, it won't mess up all my other databases. But there's the reference set to this copy of the CodeArchive, AccessDB. And by setting this reference, Access then brings in all of the code in that AccessDB and makes it available to the host database. So I'm gonna pick just a couple to show you. I believe this is the one. All right. So global constants, app colors. Again, I talked earlier about forcing consistency. If I set public enum app color and I give it these values, then wherever I call app color line green in any of my databases, I'm going to get exactly the same color. That may or may not be good. You would have to make that decision based on your application. But what that does, like I say, is it forces me to think about what colors I really want to see and what colors I don't want to replicate. The app error is another public enum. And the idea here is I have all of the, or not all, but as many of the error numbers that are potentially raised by an error with a plain language equivalent in this enum. And I'll just quickly show if we do that. And because it is set up this way, I get IntelliSense. And it returns the value. So instead of having to remember if error equals 2046 in an error handler, I can do if app error equals can't delete, and then I know that I'm going to get 2046, and Access knows what that means. So this took away, and again, this takes away some of the difficulty, complexity, or the extra effort to master the numbers of all these error messages. I just have to remember that I need to call app error, and I'm going to get IntelliSense listing of $3201. I think that's one we've seen quite often in our databases. So that's a quick example of the kind of consistency that's forced by doing it this way, and also some of the advantages of not having to redo it every time. You know, originally what I would do is take this section and copy it into every new database, but by keeping it in an archive or a code library, I guess more accurately, then I don't have to repeat it. I just refer to this master copy. Same here. Here's the sleep API, and this is my global error message. This was probably the most challenging because it really forced me to think, what do I want to see in an error handler? What kind of message do I want to present to my users? And how to make it generic so that it would work for any database anywhere when I pull this error message, this error handler in. And this is probably I'm going to say at least the third major version of this particular function. As I would go through and find out, well, this works this case, but it doesn't work there. So how do I make it more generic, more consistent to work in others? And this one I've been using for quite some time now. But you pass in the number of the error. That's the one that Access raises. The line number. Now, line number is optional, as you know. But if you set line numbering in your modules, then it'll come back. It'll send back the line number in your function which errored. This is an unfortunate choice of terms. This actually means the object that called it. As I was saying just a minute ago, I realized too late that I had a lot of places where I had referred to forms when actually there were other kinds of objects that would raise errors that I wanted to trap. So this is actually more now a generic object which created the error. And then the control or where on that object the error was raised. And then I process those, and I won't force you to go through the whole thing, but I create an error message and then show the error message to the user and ask them if they want to. It will list the error. It will list the error and the description and the line number if I pass the line number. If I pass a line number, it'll show it. It'll pass the name of the module and where it occurred in that module. And then it asks the question, do you want to send a report back to the developer? And this, if they click yes, then it opens Outlook and sends email to me. Now, obviously, if I were going to put this in a customer's application, I would have to make the decision, do I want these error reports coming to me as a developer, or do I want to replace my email with the email of someone internally in that organization who is their frontline support? So that's probably another improvement that I could make here is to pass a variable indicating where that report should go. But since I retired 5 years ago, it's a moot point, and I haven't bothered to do that. Well, this is a fun one. We started talking about Access 2010 and web databases. This comes from that era. At that point, when you published an Access, I'm getting down in the weeds, which is a common problem for me. But in those days, when we had the Access web databases, you published it to SharePoint, and then that put a property on that database indicating that it was a web database on SharePoint. And the only way to tell it, don't do this anymore, was to remove that property. And actually, I was working with Ben Clothier at the time, and Ben's the one that figured out how to do this. And I wanted to mention it partly because I was able to give this code to, I think it was Luke, who had a problem like this. And I was able to say, hey, Luke, I've got this right here in my code library. And it worked. So that was a big win for both of us. Okay. Again, I can show you some of the other code here. Some of it is more generic, more widely usable than others. But the point is, anytime I think that I can take this code and use it in multiple places, I will put it in this CodeArchive library, and then when I start any Access database linked to it, that code is automatically available to that new database. So it speaks to the idea of simplicity, as much simplicity as possible. I'm trying to avoid forking the code. I'm trying to avoid rewriting code. I'm trying to avoid code that's just so elegant that it's impossible to maintain. So that kind of wraps up what I was thinking about the presentation. Are there any questions about this or comments, suggestions? And again, I'm pretty sure that many of you have similar code libraries that you use. Does anybody have?
Hey, George.
Yeah.
How do you handle the evolution of your code library when you return to applications that you've already deployed with an earlier version of your code library?
That is an interesting question, and that goes back to the idea that I haven't had to deal with that because, like I say, I've been retired and mostly dealing with my own stuff, and so it's not a problem for me to keep half a dozen databases in sync. But that was a problem early on, and one of the reasons I went this direction is precisely that, because then I was, like I say, I was forced to be as generic as possible. Well, that's a good point. Let's go back and look at the error message, and that's actually something that I should have brought up. Okay. If I change this signature here, right now I'm passing in error number, the error line, the calling object, and the section or the control. If I change this signature in any way, what you just described is going to happen. I'm going to have to go find every instance where I did that and modify it. So, I very quickly learned, before you deploy something, make really, really sure that it is not going to have to change again. Just like table design, once you deploy your tables, you don't want to be back there putting new fields in there all the time. It's the same kind of idea, that you want to be as consistent. And I'm using the term generic, but that's really only part of what I'm trying to get. It's reusable. It doesn't have unique specific features that are only applicable in one place. But yeah, that is a potential problem, especially if you were deploying it to a customer or a client.
I maintain applications over many, many, many years.
We lost your sound.
We lost him.
We lost you.
Anybody else has any question?
Comments? Okay.
I don't use code libraries. I probably should use them for my custom code, but up to now I've avoided them.
Well, I like I say, to me, it was kind of a natural evolution to get here. And right now, well, one last thing, there's some of these in here that I probably will eventually take out. Like this login to SS. That's unique to one particular database, and it really doesn't belong here. Oh, you can see I also incorporated JStreet SQL tools. So that's a direct download from JStreet, and I just stuck it in here. So now I've got JStreet SQL tools wherever I need it. But yeah, it is. There are definitely pluses and minuses, but I kind of like it from, like I've said it several times, but I kind of like it from the point of view that, to me, it feels like it helps enforce discipline. That I'm not going to reinvent the wheel every time I start a new error handler. If I do modify this error handler, there better be a very good reason to modify it. And if there is a good reason, then you do it. But you don't just randomly start making changes. There are some other things that happen because of this, but that's the long and short of it. So I'm going to stop sharing unless there are other questions or comments.
I think Kevin's back. Kevin, you want to finish your statement?
Yeah. Was that?
Tim, that was Tim. I'm sorry,
Was that Tim?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was just going to say, one of the things I learned is not to deprecate my code library functions or procedures. If I come up with a better way to do them, I create a new version with a 1 or a 2 or a 3 after it. And that way I can consistently deploy new versions of the code library to old code without breaking it. Even if there's a better way to do it now, it still does it the old way.
Yeah.
It's a little messy. It means that in some cases I have 4 or 5 versions over 10 years, but at least I know what I'm using and what it did.
Yeah. I can see that as an alternative to what I'm doing here. I mean, if I were still actively involved in client work and bringing in new things all the time, I would probably be doing more of that. This has become fairly static because it's mostly for my own benefit. But yeah, I can see where you'd want to maintain those versions. But this allows you to do that because you can look right here in the CodeArchive. You can see version 1, version 2, version 3, and they're all right there.
Yep.
And even better, because you've got IntelliSense.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that particular function requires. So if you wanted, so if you have 2 or 3 versions of this, then you're going to be able to very quickly pop it into IntelliSense and figure out which version is the one that you need for this particular application. Yeah. I just like the fact that it's all right here. It's not scattered in a folder. It's not scattered in a half a dozen databases, and I have to open each one to look, see this is where I use that. And this is the version that I used, and that's not the one I want. So I guess another way to say being consistent and disciplined is lazy. Okay, are there any other comments or suggestions? I will stop sharing. And okay, what do you want to see this group focus on?
All right, everyone, now's your chance. What would you like for next month's topic or the following month's topic or later this year? I think, George, you already have somebody lined up for next
Oh
month.
yeah, I've got somebody lined up for next month. Thank you, Juan. I was going to mention that at the beginning, but probably better here at the end. Next month, I've asked Mike Wolf to talk to us. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mike. He's a relatively newcomer on the scene, I think. And I first became acquainted with Mike through his blog. It's called No Longer Set. I'm putting that in the chat window. And what attracted me to his blog is he's very knowledgeable. You know, he's got really strong technical chops, but he's also very articulate and very concise. Just the opposite of me. His blogs are very short, to the point, and they illustrate topics. So I reached out and asked him if he'd be willing, and he agreed to talk to us about the subject that we picked together is using arrow keys to navigate a subform with classes. And I thought that's interesting because that's a problem that everybody faces sooner or later. Yeah, how do you move around in a subform with arrow keys? And then also I understand that he's going to present at Devcon, isn't he, Juan?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, so you'll
Nice
see.
topic, Twin Basic. He's presenting a Twin Basic. I have never heard that before.
Yeah, Twin Basic is Wayne Phillips' new project. I don't know too much about it except that Wayne has been working on that for quite a while.
All right. Well, it's already 9:30 here, so I'm gonna bug out George. You guys are willing to stick around with George here for a few more minutes, especially if you have any technical support, SharePoint issues, which George is quite familiar with. George, thank you very much for presenting and to managing this chapter. Appreciate it a lot.
Well, I'm looking forward to. Oh, by the way, I should mention also the following month after that, I have tentatively arranged. Who is that? Oh, for heaven's sake, I've already forgotten.
Welcome to my world.
So Mike's up next, and then the following month will be. Oh, that's terrible.
You got 2 months to figure.
2 months to figure out. I know Albert Paloma is going to come talk to us about SharePoint. Maybe yeah. So Albert was a little bit put off when I told him I had the first 2 months scheduled, so I don't know when he's actually going to fit us in. But yeah, he's agreed to talk to us about SharePoint. I can't think of, but Juan said nobody knows more about SharePoint than me. Well, Albert knows a heck of a lot more than I do about SharePoint. So I look forward to that.
All right, George. Right. Good night. I got to run. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Anything else from anybody else? Any other subjects you want to talk about? Okay. Jack, can you comment a little bit about your statement here in the chat? Code library means functions that cannot be renamed with consistent parameters and outputs. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage?
Jack dropped.
Oh, is Jack gone? Oh yeah, Jack's already gone. Rats. Okay. Well, I'm going to follow up with him because I'm curious whether he meant that was a plus or a minus. I think of it as a plus, but he may have had a different point of view. So anybody else comments? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I will look forward to next month. And we'll learn about navigating subforms with arrows.
Thank you for doing this, George. I was excited to see your name associated with this this meeting, and that's the reason I came. So I'm excited that you're helping us with this, and I'm looking forward to being on these meetings regularly.
Oh, great. We're looking forward to it. Like I say, I was kind of out of the game for way too long, and it feels good to be back. But, you know, I really did start at 8 o'clock this morning practicing, because it's been like 2-3 years since I did anything like this. So, yeah, good. All right. Thanks again. I'll talk to you guys next month.
Thank George.
Right. Thank you. Good night.